Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We're going to give you just a minute here to get settled, but we're delighted to have you with us. Pleased to have a fantastic cast of speakers and panelists here that are going to work with us in today's session. I believe we will get started here just in one moment. Get settled, get acclimated to GoToWebinar. I apparently have spent too much time in Zoom because it took me a long time to remember how to use GoToWebinar. And it was only a few months ago. This was all I was using. So welcome, delighted to have you. As soon as Daniela on the back end, thank you to my colleague Daniela Rodriguez-Ranf, who is helping to run the logistical side of today's show. When she advances the slide, that's my cue to get us started. So continue to get settled, and thank you for being here. All right, there's the cue. That is, we are officially on. So once again, welcome. Brad Ward here with the Council on Foundations, lead strategist for community foundations for community philanthropy. Delighted to be talking about this particular topic of breaking barriers. No better time than our current political and community context to be exploring what more can be done to be linking wealthy donors to causes that are typically left out. So thank you to our partners for bringing together this research and pulling together a robust group of folks to talk through this issue. A couple reminders as you get settled in here. There is certainly a help feature within GoToWebinar. If you get disconnected, can't find yourself to get back in, having some major sound quality issues or otherwise, you can email us directly. We're going to be monitoring that at webinars@cof.org. Again, that's webinars@cof.org. That's the fastest way to get us to see what we can do to get you help. This is being recorded. It'll be available afterwards so that you can listen in and tune in again or share it with friends and colleagues. Certainly, if you would take a few minutes at the end of this webinar to answer surveys, that gives us a chance to understand how we can improve the experience and get more research out there. And if you just got to exit for any unknown reason that I simply could not fathom why you'd want to leave early, but if you need to exit, just hit the gray button and you are out of here. So with that, I want to just remind you that this is going to be as interactive as we can make it in terms of if you have clarifying questions or you have thoughts or additional thoughts that we can bring into the conversation, we encourage you to use the questions feature that's in GoToWebinar, and we will be monitoring those. So if you don't hear something immediately, please note we're working that into the conversation at the right time. To help you in getting deeper with what is going to be explored here by this all-star cast, we're going to be putting in the chat feature momentarily, if we haven't already, some links that will be of value to you here. That includes the Community Wealth Partners report, the full report that was released today, along with a blog post that they've got linked to that report, as well as some information from Stanford about these community-based relationships that Aaron will be talking more about. And I also wanted to flag, if you weren't with us at the CF United Conference pop-up series back in August, I'm going to be dropping in that link here shortly to revisit the conversation that Michigan Community Foundation leaders were having, talking in great detail about what we're exploring right here in this conversation, but more at the organizational level. And lastly, if you weren't with us during the Council's Public Policy Summit last week, we had well over 400 folks participating, tuning in to the Public Policy Summit. And there's one plenary in particular that I want to draw your attention to that was talking about advancing equity and building power in Black communities. It was a dynamic and powerful conversation that really got to the heart and the soul of what it is we're trying to do to improve our communities that are most vulnerable right now and in and out of this pandemic. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Lori, who will take us through the rest. Lori?
Thank you, Brad. Hi, everyone. I'm Lori Bartzak. I'm with Community Wealth Partners, and I'm joined today with a great panel of some diverse perspectives for this conversation. So I'm going to introduce the other speakers really quickly. First, we have Erin Andrews, who is with Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, and Erin will be presenting research that we did in partnership to understand individual donor behavior. Another partner in this work has been Ideas 42 and behavioral science experts. And from Ideas 42, we have Piyush Tantia. And Piyush will be moderating a conversation with leaders of two foundations, community foundations, that were part of another body of research that you'll be learning more about today. So first we have Ruben Orduña, who is the Vice President for Development and Donor Services at San Francisco Foundation. And we are also joined by Melissa Levesque, who is the Vice President of Development and Stewardship for the Coastal Community Foundation in South Carolina. So thanks everyone for joining. We are going to start by sharing some of the research that really will kind of undergird this conversation. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Erin to tee us off.
Thank you, Lori. Next slide, please. Thank you so much for those introductions. I'd like to start by sharing some of the research findings from our work together this year, as Lori said. So Community Wealth Partners, my lab, the Effective Philanthropy Learning Initiative at Stanford PAX, and Ideas 42, a behavioral design firm, as Lori said, collaborated this year to study the relationship between community-based organizations and high-capacity donors, who we defined as households making charitable donations in excess of $10,000 annually. Giving ranged from $13,000 to $5 million annually, with a median value of $100,000 per year. We chose the $10,000 threshold to be sure to capture younger donors who were accumulating great wealth, but maybe earlier on in their philanthropic journey and only beginning to scale up. So let's start with an overview of our research, and I'm going to actually hand it back to Lori for a couple of slides, and then I'll dive a little bit deeper. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Great. So just some context on why we're focused on the behavior of high capacity donors. So for us at Community Wealth Partners, we work with nonprofits across the country who are working on a range of issues. And from our work with nonprofits, we see firsthand what a difference it makes when an organization has the resources that they need to invest in their own capacity. We also unfortunately have seen that a lot of organizations don't have the flexible funding at levels that they need to really be able to invest in their systems and operations. And in the past couple of years, there have been a few studies that have come out that have really pointed to the fact that this is especially true for organizations that are working in communities, community-based organizations, and also organizations led by people of color. So when we thought about what we might be able to do to help change this reality for nonprofits, we became really interested in thinking about how we might influence the behavior of individual donors. Next slide, please. So we know that wealthy donors play a critical role in the funding landscape. So you see a bunch of stats here. I'll call out that individuals in the top 1/5 of income distribution make up almost 2/3 of charitable contributions, 63%. And so when you think about what if we could just influence those funders and their resources, you can see how much that might be able to impact the sector. So next slide, please. So with that in mind, we wanted to just understand them better. And we saw that there's a lot of data out there about why donors give and where donors give, but we didn't see as much data in the field about how they give. So with that, we partnered with the Effective Philanthropy Learning Initiative and Ideas 42 to do some research to gain a better understanding of donors' motivations and their practices related to giving. And so now Erin's going to give some highlights of what we learned from the research on individual donors. Next
Thanks,
slide.
Lori. Perfect. Thank you so much. So let's start with our methodology. We first interviewed 8 community-based organization leaders across the Bay Area and the East Coast to understand their experiences with high-capacity donors. So we wanted to understand what challenges they were facing, particularly in relation to capacity building and fundraising in the organizations we interviewed had ranges of annual expenses from about 1 million to about 30 million. So you can see there's quite a range in the size of the community-based organizations we spoke with. Then we interviewed 34 high-capacity donors across the US. Many came from technology, financial services, venture capital, private equity, investment banking, and some from business and healthcare. And their ages ranged from 30 to 74. Next slide, please. Our interviews were semi-structured and focused on the donor's background and experience with philanthropy. So how did they structure their gifts? How did donors find and vet nonprofits? And if and how donors solicit advice related to philanthropic topics. Next slide. We know that major donors can be critical allies to nonprofits. They can provide flexible funding, they can offer connections to other donors, and in some cases contribute through board or other volunteer service. Our literature review found a number of gaps and opportunities though. So research by the Center for Effective Philanthropy found that 2/3 of nonprofit leaders would rather receive support from major donors than from foundations because it's easier to manage those relationships, and major donors tend to give more multi-year and unrestricted funding. CEP research also found that 92% of nonprofit leaders say it's important for funders to provide repeated support, but only 59% say that most do. 92% of nonprofit leaders say it's important for donors to provide unrestricted gifts, but only 54% say that all of their major donors, most or all of their major donors do so. Bridgespan research found that many social change focused organizations don't have the capacity to engage deeply with major donors and raise and steward gifts at the levels that often universities, hospitals, and other large institutions are receiving from major donors. And then lastly, Open Impact found that 74% of community-based organizations in Silicon Valley say they don't have access to high net worth donor networks. So these were just some of the challenges and gaps that we identified through our literature review. Next slide, please. Let's first look at some of the findings from our conversations with nonprofit leaders. The nonprofit leaders with whom we spoke expressed an interest in decreasing their reliance on institutional funders who they fear may pivot away from their issue areas in the coming years. On the bright side, we found that the majority of funding from individuals to these CBOs is unrestricted general operating support. This was really great news to hear. Rather boldly even, some development directors said they had started saying no to donors who wished to restrict their gifts. That was a really big deal. They also felt that individual donors are typically easier to solicit and often require less paperwork and reporting. In terms of challenges, these leaders said that most donors do not make multi-year pledges. Though when we pressed them for more information, it turned out that most nonprofit leaders weren't asking for that kind of support either, though they all admitted that multi-year support improves efficiencies in their fundraising cycle and contributes to the longer-term stability of their organization. Development directors also expressed concern about older donors passing away and it being difficult to cultivate a younger generation of donors. Rather surprisingly, when asked to define a large gift, development directors cited as low as $1,000 for that threshold. We thought that was noteworthy to share. Next slide, please. On the donor side, surprisingly, happily, and consistently, we discovered that the donors we spoke with prefer to provide unrestricted support. This is a major and important finding, and we really do hope that the tides have actually turned on this point. We found that donors who had experience working with nonprofits or having worked in the nonprofit sector were more inclined to give unrestricted funding. They simply understood the importance. Unfortunately, we found that donors are less likely to give multi-year gifts of support to nonprofits beyond their alma maters and religious institutions. And when we pressed them on this topic, donors said they had to know the leader very well and where the organization was going in order to feel comfortable making a multi-year pledge. We asked donors directly, if the nonprofit asked you to make a multi-year pledge, would you do it? And most said yes, they'd consider it, just no one was asking them. I'll tell a quick story here of one donor we interviewed who was adamant about never giving multi-year pledges beyond her alma mater. We then asked her about her volunteer work with nonprofits and what lessons she was learning about the challenges they were facing. She said their greatest challenge was fundraising, not surprisingly, and having to hustle every year to raise enough money. But she still couldn't make the connection that multi-year pledges could easily solve that challenge, something she would absolutely never consider doing. Fortunately, she was in the minority in that opinion, and most of the donors with whom we spoke said they would consider making multi-year pledges if only they were asked. Not surprisingly, we found that in order to make a large gift, which donors defined as anywhere from $5,000 to $1 million, they had to have a deep connection to the mission, a long-standing relationship with the organization, and trust in the leadership. We also found that the donors who provided the largest gifts were also engaged directly and deeply with the organizations through board service and other types of volunteering, and spent a lot of time thinking about philanthropy in general. Of course, there were many more findings and nuances that we share in the report. Next slide, please. As we thought about these findings, we identified a few additional challenges that are worth addressing. Next slide, please. Many donors are choosing nonprofits because of their reputation or because of the long-standing relationship they have with the organizations. However, smaller charities may have less brand awareness and may not have the capacity to develop relationships with high-capacity donors. And this could be contributing to some of the racial disparities we're seeing in the sector. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. Research from Building Movement Project's Race to Lead initiative found that 63%, the prior slide, I'm sorry, thank you. There we go, perfect. Found that 63% of people of color executive directors and CEOs cited lack of access to individual donors and a fundraising challenge compared to 49% of white leaders. Next slide, please. And lastly, community-based organization leaders may be additionally disadvantaged because they lack access to advanced fundraising practices. They may have limited resources for trainings, time constraints, may be trained to ask for as little as possible or ask for one-off gifts to support programs or leverage emotional appeals. So we wanted to think about what can we do to minimize these disparities and encourage donors to contribute multi-year unrestricted support and connect donors with community-based organizations who are disadvantaged in this fundraising process. So that's what we want to explore with you today as we engage two community foundation leaders and how they're creatively solving some of these challenges. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Lori, who's going to describe what we're seeing there. Thank you.
Thanks, Erin. So yeah, as Erin said, as we think about the ways that we might be able to connect donors to nonprofits that are meeting the greatest needs in communities, we see just great opportunity for community foundations. And we already know that community foundations are playing a vital role directing resources to where the greatest needs are in communities. And this year they've proven it over and over again through COVID response funds across the country. And so we recognize that many community foundations already have practices in place that are connecting donors to nonprofits that they would have never known or crossed paths with if not for the help of the community foundation. And we also see from this data that there's some room for improvement. And so in a second body of research, Community Wealth Partners interviewed staff members from 13 community foundations that represented a range of geographies and asset sizes. And we wanted to learn ways in which community foundations are thinking differently about their role and the practices that they're taking to help deepen engagement between donors and community-based nonprofits, and in particular organizations led by people of color in their communities. So today we published the findings of that report, and Brad has shared that in the chat, and we will get the links to both reports out to you in an email afterwards as well. But today we have two of the foundations that were part of that research. So we have Ruben from San Francisco Foundation and Melissa from the Coastal Community Foundation. And they are going to share some of the newer practices that they're putting into place in their foundations. And we hope that, by them sharing this, it will be helpful to all of the community foundations on this call today. And so Piyush is going to lead the conversation with Ruben and Melissa. I am going to stay on and I'll be monitoring the questions. So feel free to chat in your questions to any of us through the question box, and I'll keep an eye on that. But Piyush, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Lori, and great to be here. And Ruben and Melissa, thank you very much for agreeing to this conversation. So why don't we start with the following? I know both of you do a lot on this. How do you even in the first place begin to understand the needs of the community, and then which are these smaller, perhaps lesser known community-based organizations or others who are trying to solve those needs? So maybe we can start with Melissa and then go to Ruben.
Sure, absolutely. One of the things that Coastal Community Foundation did several years ago was we had a very broad-based number of community conversations throughout our 9-county footprint. We wanted to have small community conversations, and we worked with partners that included other grant-making foundations, United Ways, but other community groups to make sure we were meeting with people that weren't necessarily the usual suspects that we all knew. And we used the Harwood model method, and we started out with, what are your aspirations to have a really vibrant community? And we didn't start with a list of 10 questions that we were profiling. We said, tell us what you want. And what came through with those conversations was that it didn't matter if you were in a rural portion of our area or a more urban area, rich, poor, lots of demographics. It came through that there were 3 things that everybody was focused on: affordability of spaces and inclusive spaces, access to economic opportunity, and then also education. And education not just being schools, but it also included skills-based training for people in the workforce. And as part of those conversations, we got tremendous knowledge, but we also learned about lots of other organizations that we might not have known about as well. And we took that information and we reconciled it with hard data from a research partner at a university. And with that, we had a good picture, but what we chose to do as an extra step was we had town halls where we went back to all of the areas where we had had conversations. So we reported what we found and said, does this resonate? Does this sound right? And by following that model, we learned about a lot of other organizations we might not have known about. We made great partnerships on the ground in communities that we serve. And it really helped us from a credibility standpoint to start having an ongoing dialogue that, we might not have had as strong a dialogue, maybe 10 or 15 years ago. And that was really the first start to find out about more organizations, get connected with them, and let them get with us.
Thank you. I especially love what you said about going back to check the findings, because there's all of this literature, scientific literature on what we call procedural justice, is how people judge decisions to be fair or unfair. And the key element that matters is if they had a voice or felt like they were participating in the decision. Regardless of if the outcome goes against them or not, they still think it's fair if they participated. So that's really fantastic.
It made a big difference. We had a group that said no one's ever done this before, and it helped a lot.
That's great. Ruben, can you turn it over to you? Question.
Yep, sure. Nice to be here on this call. So very similar to Melissa's experience. Several years back, maybe 5 or so, we had a transition in leadership. Fred Blackwell joined the foundation, and historically the San Francisco Foundation had always been viewed as a good grant maker, good social justice grant maker, committing to that theme. But in Fred's arrival, he asked the very basic question, like, what difference have we made in the Bay Area? So that simple question led to a whole year worth of convenings with all the key stakeholders to the foundation, nonprofits, big and small, public sector, donors, other funders. And we had these convenings that were sort of theme-based on an issue, just to kind of get a sense of where people are or were. We hired the public equity group, a consulting firm, to work with us to identify data sources, to give us a picture of what the Bay Area was going through. And that felt like you're drinking data out of a fire hose, is what Fred says, but we were, it took a lot of sifting through it with their assistance, and really the result was not surprising, right? That the inequality in the Bay Area was just not acceptable. I mean, kind of given at the time, pre-COVID, right, one of the best economies in the world, it was not, helping everybody at the same level. Housing prices, workforce training, the demographics. I mean, in San Francisco was considered one of the most racially diverse areas in the state of California, yet San Francisco was becoming white. So there was just a lot of information that pointed to the problems of the growing inequality of the Bay Area. The second thing we learned from the group is that while they viewed us as a funder, historically, they felt there was really no one else organization in the position that we were at, where we had money, we had relationships, we were not elected, where like we could speak up, right? We could take that leading position to call things out, right? To begin to highlight the problems that were happening in the Bay Area. Funny, as the principal fundraiser there, I was not concerned at all that us taking an approach or an opinion would have an impact. Now, we are the bluest of blue, right? So there is that in San Francisco and the region. The other thing we did is we have these relationships with PolicyLink, right? Fred's mother works over there. We hired Judith Bell, who was there, but it was a tremendous thought partner for us, and really we committed to building out what we call an equity atlas that would begin to look at the Bay Area with an equity lens, to provide information and data to others, organizations of all sizes, but it had a focus actually on grassroots. It's giving them the ability to pull data to be able to make their case for the movement building they were trying to do. So, and that journey is continuing. I mean, we were about to do a whole nother series of convenings, and then COVID hit. So, however, even in the COVID environment that we're in now and the urgency of it, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of give and take with grassroots organizations and leaders about certain work that we're doing. And we also became very engaged in the election here in California. And that put us in a new place to meet with new kinds of nonprofits and the opportunity of trying to bring donors along into that kind of work as well. So I would say that was the big moment when we pivoted to the equity agenda, but it is we're continuing to look for ways that we can get feedback on what's happening in the region.
And speaking of bringing donors along, Ruben, how did you do that? What have you done?
How are we trying to do that? Yeah, so I've thought a lot about this, and I think for us, or the way I view the relationship with donors is, I think one of the primary responsibilities we have is to help our donors become better informed residents and citizens of the region. That ought to be one of the job one I mean, yes, we are working with them to help facilitate their philanthropy, but you know, the region matters to the San Francisco Foundation, right? We are a community foundation. And that's where our expertise is, that's where our focus is. And if we can get a donor to feel that they're better informed, you know, they're going to recognize and understand the issues that we're seeing. You know, so I think that is key. The other aspect of it is bringing data to the equation, right, and to the discussion, and finding ways that we can continue to inform donors about what is happening in their backyard. And then there's some creative things that my colleague Nicole and her team are trying to do to really engage donors that are going to require the foundation to do some power sharing with donors, and that's going to be an interesting journey. But we're committed to try to find new ways of plugging these important residents and citizens of the region into the work.
And Melissa, how about you?
I would just echo what Ruben has said, and also to be willing to be creative and try some new strategies to educate your donors. You know, I would say over the past several years, it's pretty much been a three-pronged strategy or process to create a more educated donor base on other organizations and issues. I mean, they're educated on what they're passionate about already. This is just adding more context for what's happening in the community. The first, Ruben had mentioned the Equity Atlas. Several years ago, our grant making and community leadership group really did a deep dive and put an equity lens on our own competitive grant making. And that was important because we thought that we were giving more unrestricted money to a more diverse group of nonprofits than we actually were. And that helped us sort of revise the way we had our competitive grant making proposals. It's amazing if you have a proposal process that requires a trained grant writer, you're going to exclude some really important groups that you want to fund. So that was part of it. The second is bringing the knowledge that we have through community leadership in our role as a convener where we serve, and bringing stakeholders and donors together to be better informed on issues that are key issues, not ideological, that came through the civic engagement agenda that people along our coast told us they were most concerned about. So for example, we would have programs where we would start, and this was pre-COVID, where we would have a presentation where we had donors in remote sites that, you know, would tie into a larger presentation and then break out into questions and answers with local community experts on those issues where they lived. So that way you had local donors talking to local experts specifically about those issues, because if you live in a rural portion of our footprint, you don't really care as much about what's happening in Charleston. You care about what's happening in your own backyard and talking with other donors who have those same interests and concerns. So that was another portion that we did. And then the third is making sure when we're having our individual reviews with our fund holders, it's not a secret what our fund holders like to support because we write their grants. So we already know what they're interested in, and from there, you know, we can say you've given a lot of money related to, you know, some housing affordability issues. You know, would you like to learn a little bit more about this? And here are some organizations on the ground that you might not be aware of, but they're doing some really interesting work. And, you know, would you like to see some more about them, or let us schedule a site visit? So it's a way that we're trying to respect donor intent, but we're leveraging the convenings and all the conversations that we've had to introduce donors to nonprofits that are doing great work on the ground they might not know about. And that so far has been pretty well received. And that's something that it's always a work in progress, but it's something that we strive to do, and our donors appreciate having these options that we're bringing to them.
Yeah, you know, the other piece, if I can add, is that it's a challenge. I mean, it is. We're constantly kind of working on this. I mean, one of the biggest challenges we have, in all honesty, is our communications, is translating the work that the foundation is trying to achieve in the equity agenda in a way where donors see themselves as part of that solution, right? I mean, we have a big endowment, discretionary endowment. So, you know, we talk at a level that oftentimes is not at the level that donors see their work, right? Housing is a perfect example, right? We are all in at a policy level. We've got these massive funds at a regional scale. Yet we have our largest donor is very committed to homelessness in the city of San Francisco. And he understands the level that we approach housing. He's not interested in that. He's interested in getting it at the ground level. So it has taken us a while to connect the two and try to create space where the ecosystem of addressing housing has to take multiple approaches. So that's why I say it's not easy. There's a lot of translation that we have to do so that one can see themselves in the work and is part of the solution.
Absolutely. And just to kind of stay on this thread is, you know, we spend a lot of time trying to make sure that in our communications with donors and stakeholders, we're highlighting their victories and successes of what they're doing in our community. And with Coastal Community Foundation, we have a much smaller discretionary amount of grant making. So we lead with smaller discretionary grants and try to bring in a lot of social and intellectual and reputational capital to have some of our fund holders financially co-invest with us. And one thing that we do is when we talk about an issue that involves equity and a key issue in our community, you know, we'll have a lead story about the issue, but in our donor spotlights, we try to show the successes of individual donors and how they're using their philanthropy to help make a difference on some of these issues as well. So I would definitely say when you're taking this route, you need to have your development and stewardship and your marketing and communications working very much in alignment, and also as a real partner with your grant making and community leadership department, because that combination is very powerful for donors, but it's also great for communities.
So much there. So interesting. A few things from a behavioral science perspective that jump out at me. One is the feedback. So you're playing back to donors what they're already doing and kind of replaying this identity that, oh, it seems you like to support X and let us help you with that. That's really great. We've done some work with not high net worth of everyday givers along those lines. It's also been quite successful. The other is you're almost like endowing your trusted relationship, right, on these other organizations that donors may not know about because you're recommending them. You're kind of saying like, hey, here's someone else who's doing great work that you didn't know about. So yeah, both fantastic. I want to close with one question before I ask Lori and Aaron to jump back in case they have any thoughts. This is all different. It was probably a big change, and the one thing we know from all this behavioral research is change is really hard for people. What was some of the resistance that you came upon, and how did you sort of get over it?
I'm happy to jump in. I guess there was, you know, from the donor perspective, I mean, we heard comments about, you know, you're getting too political in some sense, right? That you perhaps, you know, that's, you know, not in your lane kind of thing. But, you know, we haven't lost any donors because of that. I think again, I think as we become more public and we're talking now to wider audience. You know, if our arguments are really based on data and fact, right? I mean, it's you know, you just put it there, and I think people tend to resonate, right? You know, I mean, so I don't. The challenge actually is also from an internal perspective, in terms of you have an organization that has 100 people, and we pivoted our grant making, right? We pivoted the way we invest. We pivoted the way we want to measure success in terms of fundraising. And, you know, that's not an easy thing to do. So it's not like people don't want to do it, but I think people are sort of still connected in the ways that used to work. And the one thing we've learned so far is it's not about the grants. It's not about the foundation. It's really about the issues in the region. And if you can agree on that, right, then you can reverse engineer and try to pull whatever levers you need to pull, including the donors. And in introducing donors to new ways of thinking is an important lever. So there are some, the more the challenge I find is more in the internal kind of structure than the external piece with our donors. Again, we're in the bluest of blue, so it is a little bit, could be different.
Yeah, I would say with Coastal Community Foundation, one of the things for us was we're fortunate we haven't lost donors. I think we have donors that are even more engaged now in some areas than they had been previously. But I would just say is, you know, we didn't suddenly just get into the position where we are right now. It was a very intentional decision that was made 5 years ago. And it really became a question of sequencing and prioritizing, which was, we weren't going to go from 0 to 60 right away. So it was making sure, you know, internally, everyone on our team goes through Racial Equity Institute training. So we kind of have the same baseline of language and communication on equity issues. The other thing that we did was we started taking some incremental steps. And, you know, 5 years later, you know, we're at this point where we've built this credibility in the space, but we've also worked hard to invite donors to say, this isn't either or in terms of what you've always wanted to do with your grant making, and now we think you should just do this. What we've worked hard to say is this is and both. What you've always done with your grant making, you know, you're supporting organizations that add to the quality of life in lots of areas that people enjoy where we live. Here are some other organizations where you can kind of take that next step up and think about that. And that's something that has been, that's resonated with donors, I would say, because, you know, when somebody starts a fund with us, it's usually to fund their philanthropic passion versus ours. So we're respectful, but we show where that intersection exists. And we try to have a relationship where we're sharing and co-investing in our community together. And that message has really started to receive good traction. And that's what we work on. The other part, and this was something that was more recent, is we actually put together an advocacy policy agenda on issues related to affordability, housing, and education that came through from our community conversations. And, you know, at first you can have a question of saying, well, are you getting political? And what we said was, actually, this is an extension of stewardship. How many times have you funded certain organizations or certain issues, and sometimes your ceiling is something that you can't control unless you do provide some educational resources in an advocacy standpoint. So that's one way that we've kind of taken that step, but used language that made it easier for donors to take that step with us.
Can I make one final point on that? So I think I'm just going to, as a challenge to my colleagues who are listening in here, you know, this is a moment in time that we've never lived through. And if you're thinking about, how to engage donors and increase the impact, it is the time, I think, to really rethink the relationship that we have traditionally had with donors and really what drives that, right? I mean, the kinds of questions that Nicole's team gets from donors about, how do you defund police? What is that? What does that look like? I mean, it really is a moment that I think as we look back, it's going to be critical that this is when we change the relationship in ways that were, yes, supporting donors, but it's really focused about the community and kind of building it out. So I really hope that people are looking at that as an opportunity to redefine what that means.
Thanks. Lori, I'll turn it back to you if you or Aaron have any thoughts. We do have a couple of questions here. I don't know if you can see them, Lori.
Yeah. I'd like to share a couple of things. And Aaron, if you want to chime in, you can join back, and then I can, and then I'll switch to the questions that are coming in. But I just wanted to say, Ruben and Melissa, again, thank you. And a lot of what you've shared really resonates with what I heard in the interviews that we did with community foundations across the country. I think we really did hear on this question of, what might the consequences be of taking a stand with our donors, even in red states as well as blue states. The ones that we spoke to, I think by and large found that the benefits really did outweigh the risks. And yes, if you lose a couple donors, you're going to gain a lot more because the value proposition is clearer. So that was something I heard a lot. And Melissa, just everything you described about the intentional approach was another thing that I've heard a lot of community foundations going through. And a number of them pointed out that the events of this year, so COVID and then the murder of George Floyd, just forced people into action, where maybe they'd been spinning and thinking and lots of talking and opining that foundations tend to do, but not really acting, that this kind of forced them to behave in new ways. And now there's an opportunity, as some community foundations feel like they can kind of come out of emergency response mode a bit, to kind of go back to that thoughtful work, see what they've learned from their emergency response, and make their plans more solid. So those are some of the things I wanted to share. Erin, what about you? What's coming up for you?
Yeah, thank you. Great discussion, you guys. Really value hearing what your communities are doing to engage your donors. Through the research that we've done over the years, we do sometimes talk with donors who are part of a community foundation, and many are not, as you might imagine. And one of the things that I'm hearing from so many donors is, especially with what is happening in the world, they want to be engaged in these conversations, but there isn't a place for them to do so. They don't know where to find the right resources. And so I just see such an opportunity for community foundations to not only play a leadership role within the existing donor relationships that you have and being able to leverage the connections you have to other nonprofits and bring those folks together. But I guess one of my questions and reflections from this conversation is, how can we amplify what you do? How can we get this good work, this good connecting, these good relationships, opportunities, funding opportunities out to the donors who might not already be engaged in your community foundations directly, which of course could become a pipeline for future donor engagement for your communities in any case. But I just see a greater opportunity here and just wonder in what way, how you guys think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think of it in that it's also the foundation itself that has to change, right? I mean, that, not one size fits all, and that's kind of how we've been operating all these years. And if we're going to be attracting new types of donors, or if we want to be introducing new types of organizations, I think we're going to have to get creative in terms of the kinds of funds and structures and what we're willing to get into in order to adapt to the environment to help with the impact. Because I don't see us, like the donor advised fund, continue to be the one thing. I mean, I think there's going to be change. So I just think we have to adapt as organizations to open us a little bit more to different ways of thinking from the donors and also the grantees.
I would agree. I would say that two things that I think will make a big difference bringing to the table is, certainly, bringing creativity, but also bringing courage. Over the summer, our CEO and our board took a very specific and unapologetic statement on race and systemic racism, and it's where we are. It's where we stand. We believe that is real. And but at the same time, and this kind of ties into what Ruben said, is we have different on-ramps that people can become engaged and become involved with issues that we're part of. So we set up a place-based impact investing fund, which is not grant making. It's social impact investing. We have our competitive grant making. We have convenings with stakeholders that we invite many people to come in so we can educate on issues and have forums where you can ask questions. We do programs with advisors, with others. So we're trying to find multiple ways that people can be part of the conversation. And candidly, for us, we have to, because our discretionary grant-making assets aren't as large as other groups. We're a 45-year-old foundation, and we have generous funds, but we have big challenges, and having co-investment with donors as well as others in the community is really key to getting those results.
I have some questions from participants that I can bring in. I've got a few just talking tactics here. So Melissa, the first one I'll ask to you. Somebody asked about, you mentioned changing your grant making practices when you realized that you weren't giving to the types of organizations maybe you thought to or wanted to be more equitable. Can you tell us what some of those changes were?
Sure. What I would say, and this was more through our grant making and community leadership group, is, part of it was looking at our applications and just saying, what are some things that could be a barrier to entry. Part of it is you want to have accountability and metrics and so forth. But sometimes, are you asking for such a level that it's a barrier to entry for some smaller groups that just might not have the tracking resources or the staff capacity to measure all of that? I mean, we're definitely about impact and accountability, but we really look to see, how can we make it a fair process for a lot of groups? With one of our grant making programs, part of what we've done is, we have a portion it's a grant pool for organizations that have operating budgets of $500,000 or less. So we can have some things that are more designed for them. So it was really looking at how the application process, what it feels like to somebody at different nonprofit levels trying to get in. And then from there, looking at our scoring process as well to make sure that we weren't, weighing too heavily certain categories that might handicap a smaller organization. But whoever this person is, if they want to message privately, I'd be happy to get you in touch with our our grant making group.
Great, thank you. Another question that came in was maybe for you both, but Ruben, let's start with you. People are wondering, how are you keeping donors engaged during these times when everything's virtual? So is there anything that you learned that seems to be working especially well right now?
Yeah, I mean, we're all trying, right? However, I think one of the things that we hit on recently is because of the relationship that the foundation has in the community, we were able to invite folks with names, or is it celebrities or whatever, that people would recognize that are in the space. So Kamal Bell is a perfect example, right? Inviting him to speak about, racial justice I mean, that just drew a big audience. It was, you know, and again, it was after George Floyd, so there was just a lot of interest. We invited Eric Holder in the last one to come in and talk to us, and that also with the elections has generated a lot of interest. So, I mean, it may not be the most sustainable way, but I think, you know, finding experts in that particular with some name does help in these Zoom kind of environments. And also just, I mean, the timing of it, right? At noon, it's very easy to go in and out, right? So we had to think about the timing of it as well, the length, the interaction. We started to do these breakout groups within it so people could meet the speaker and get a little bit more engaged. So we're trying, you know, but it is harder.
Yeah, I would say it's looking at multiple ways to try to engage donors. Some of it's going to be virtual programming. For this current year, we're probably going to do 16 education programs, but that's split across some different channels. So we have professional advisors where we do some things for them. We're doing we did a huge capacity building training series for nonprofits during the summer. That was direct, you know, skills work in a post-COVID environment, well, in COVID environment. And then also having our community engagement and donor education programs as well. Because, you know, sometimes it may be something where a donor only wants to talk to you once a year. You know, you might not talk to them as much, but if they hear something very positive about an organization that they've funded with grants, that, you know, here's what I'm learning through some programs that the Community Foundation is offering to nonprofits, you know, to work in this COVID environment, that pays off as well. So I would say we do that. The other part is, you know, just talking to donors and asking how they're doing. Sometimes even separate from, you know, having this as something we want you to think about. You know, it's a challenging year for everyone, and donors deal with some of the same challenges and personal stresses that we all do. So it's really digging deep into the relationships that you do have, and that just pays dividends down the road.
Thank you. So we only have a few more minutes, and I want to squeeze in one more question, and it's kind of a big one. So somebody asked, how are you sharing power within your foundation? So most community foundations historically have been predominantly white-led. We're talking about building stronger relationships with people of color. So are there approaches that you're taking to help share some of the power with people of color in your community? And so maybe if you could both just share like one practice that's working well in the final minutes that we have, that would be great.
So we're moving to a kind of a common app format, right? As opposed to each of the, what we call them pathways, or our grant making. And one of the fundamental principles in developing the common app is this idea of sharing power around the grant making. Right, that we understand that we really need the input of those that are on the street to make some of these calls too, right? So that on the donor perspective, as I mentioned, Nicole is starting to think about ways that we can bring donors together in kind of a power sharing with the leadership of the grantees, with some of the expertise at the foundation to try to do that. You know, that's going to be a hard one, especially for an old foundation that has a big endowment that's been historically in this space. But Fred is very much committed to that concept, and you know, we're going to try it and see how we can engage the nonprofits.
I would just say Coastal Community Foundation, our CEO is wonderful, Darren Goss, and we are a Black-led community foundation. And with Darren and in concert with our board, we have shown a tremendous commitment to being inclusive and looking like our community. And one of the things that we do is we have a common application for grant making, but more specifically, with some of our competitive grant making grants committees, you know, those have members of the community that serve on those committees. And we want to make sure that those review committees are representative of what our community looks like. And they bring up questions. The more diverse you have with that community composition, you're actually going to get a better result, better grant making, better products. And we've embraced that, and it's made a big difference in what we're doing.
Thank you. Well, I feel like we could have just scratched the surface on a few topics and we could have gone much deeper, but I know we are about out of time. So Piyush, Ruben, Melissa, and Aaron, thank you so much for joining. And I'm going to turn it back to Brad to wrap us up.
Melissa, you must have had a radar. You nailed that right at the 3 o'clock hour. So thank you. And Lori, thank you. For all of you, just a reminder, you can continue this conversation on the Philanthropy Exchange for those of you who are members of the council. And those of you who are not, the Executive Exchange is available to non-members as well as members so that you can connect during this important time and continue these types of conversation threads. Once again, thank you so much to all of you for the research, for the data, for the conversation, the real anecdotes of how this is playing out, and for being honest and frank with us about the challenges that it comes with, as well as the aspirations. So with that, we wish everyone a great rest of the afternoon. We'll be following up within the next week or so with this recording and additional resources. And with that, we will send you on your way. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.